this week's segment of 8 to 10 minutes, we will be covering the Vietnam War. We have two very old Vietnam War veterans that are willing to tell their story. We also have a special interview with President Kennedy. Some of the things that we will include is why President Kennedy and Johnson increased U.S. involvement in Vietnam, analyze the difficulty of physical fighting, analyze the institution of the draft during the Vietnam War, explain how the war opposition movement developed and prospered, explain why the Tet Offensive and evaluate its effects, explain how President Nixon's policies impacted U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, and lastly, explain how the Vietnam War ended. Let's take a look at our interview with President Kennedy. President Kennedy, why did you increase U.S. involvement in the situation arising in Vietnam?
Well, Anderson, I was concerned by the recent advancements made by communist movement in South Vietnam. Also, I definitely did not want communism to spread or grow to other countries. Also, my advisor strongly urged me to increase economic and military support in South Vietnam. We trained the local military militia in combat.
I see. Was there anything else that led to the U.S. involvement?
The Operation Rolling Thunder, which was a coordinated aerial and naval strike that was largely regarded as a failure that escalated our involvement in the Civil War and pulled American ground troops into combat and led scores of downed U.S. flyers, spending years in North Vietnam POW camps.
Yes, that would definitely force our involvement. Now tell me about the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Well, that also played a big role in our involvement in Vietnam.
How so?
Well, it started with the U.S. destroyer, the USS Maddox. It went into North Vietnamese waters for intel and a naval strike when it suddenly realized it was being followed by North Vietnamese torpedo boats.
And then what happened?
The U.S. ship fired a warning shot.
Did it work?
No, the ship immediately took fire, so the USS Maddox retaliated and sunk the torpedo boats. With help of the U.S. bombers. Because of this, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution enabling President Johnson to expand U.S. involvement without a formal declaration of war.
President Kennedy had to leave soon after that, so we did not get to talk much more. Next up, we will be talking about the difficulty of physical fighting during the Vietnam War. And to do that, we have an interview with a very old Vietnam War veteran that's willing to tell his tragic story. Let's go to that interview now. So what was the fighting like on the ground during the war?
Well, it was very difficult.
How so?
Well, the whole country was covered in jungle and it was extremely hot. We were not properly trained to fight this kind of environment, unlike the enemy who was very skilled in this type of combat.
Yes, that does sound difficult. What were some other things you can tell me about the fighting?
Well, the enemy utilized guerrilla warfare, which is an irregular type of warfare in which a small group of combatants utilizes ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run tactics to defeat a larger, less mobile army. It was extremely hard to fight against, and we lost many soldiers due to guerrilla warfare.
Now, what was the average life like when you were not fighting?
Life as a soldier usually revolved around sleeping in makeshift bunkers in the jungle, freezing, afraid to make any kind of fire due to possible detection from the Vietnamese. Food was also scarce or non-existent in the jungle.
That is just awful.
Indeed.
Now tell me about the aerial fighting.
Well, that was a difficult situation, Anderson.
And what was so difficult about it?
Well, the U.S. controlled most of the airspace and dominated almost all aerial fights.
I'm not seeing what was so difficult about the situation.
Well, you see, Anderson, since the U.S. was so dominant in aerial fighting, they were closely watched by the other communist countries, and the moment the U.S. abused their power, these communist countries were ready to come to the Vietnamese aid. This could possibly cause a third world war because of the U.S. had to limit their power in aerial involvement.
I see. Let's get away from the war front for now and talk about what was going on back home. Explain to me the institution of the draft and how it works.
One-third of the U.S. Army were draftees from the ages 18 to 25. People drafted had to show up to their local draft board. The draft board decided who would go and who would stay. But people who had mental or physical problems, were married, had children, attending college, or were needed at home to support their families might be granted deferments. Because of this, many people tried to avoid the draft by faking any one of these reasons. Those people were called draft dodgers.
But why was the draft instituted?
The draft was instituted simply because the government needed more troops for the army.
I guess that makes sense. Next, we have a U.S. Congressman talking to us about the war opposition movement and how it developed and prospered. Let's go to that interview now. So tell me, Mr. Congressman, what was the war opposition movement like?
Well, it was pretty violent at times. One time was the Kent State shooting. This happened on May 4th, 1970. During this, the National Guardsmen were on the Kent State campus to maintain order during a protest against the expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia. The National Guard suddenly fired upon the already dispersing crowd of student protesters. For this reason, is still unknown. This shooting killed 4 and wounded 9 other students.
Any other details you can share?
Of course, the protesters held 3 rallies in 3 days, and each day the National Guard broke up the rally. On the 4th day, the National Guard ordered the dispersion of the rally before it even started. When the protesters refused to leave, the National Guard used tear gas, but it was ineffective due to the shifting winds. Then the National Guard advanced on the crowd with bayonets attached to their rifles. At this sight the crowd scattered. The guard started to walk away when suddenly nearly a dozen of them turned around and began firing at the students. 67 bullets were fired in 13 seconds.
That is simply horrific.
Indeed it is, but that is not the worst thing that has happened.
What could be worse than that?
It is called the My Lai Massacre. This was one of the most horrific acts of violence against civilians throughout the Vietnam War. American soldiers killed almost an entire village. Over 500 women and children were raped and slaughtered. The U.S. Army covered up this for nearly a year before it was reported by the press.
That is very tragic.
Very.
Next question. What were the Pentagon Papers?
The Pentagon Papers were mostly an indictment of the Democratic administration, but they fed the Nixon administration preoccupation with finding information in documented leaks. They eventually led to the secret White House plumber group and then to Watergate.
Very interesting. But we need to move on to the Tet Offensive. What exactly was that?
The Tet Offensive was a coordinated series of North Vietnamese attacks on more than 100 cities and outposts in South Vietnam. The offensive was an attempt to form rebellions throughout the population of South Vietnam and encourage the U.S. to decrease their involvement in the Vietnam War. Even though there were heavy casualties, North Vietnamese achieved a strategic victory with the Tet Offensive. The attacks marked a turning point in the war and the beginning of the Americans' withdrawal.
Touch the rainbow.
Next to the interview, we have former President Nixon. Mr. Nixon, how did your policies affect the war?
Well, I started a program called Vietnamization. Under this program, we would build up South Vietnamese forces so they could assume more responsibility for the war.
What was the next step in the program?
As South Vietnam became stronger and more capable, U.S. troops would withdraw from combat. I withdrew 60,000 U.S. troops, and in return, we gave the South Vietnamese more modern equipment to help them build up their army. In 1970, I also expanded air and ground operations into Cambodia and Laos in attempts to block enemy supply routes, but this led to new waves of protests. Facing pressure from the protesters, I wanted to withdraw without abandoning South Vietnam.
How do you think these policies affected the war?
I think my policies started to bring the war to an end for the United States. My policies also allowed South Vietnam to build up their army so it would be able to fight in the war without as much support from the United States. My policies started to send troops home, and that's what people believed was the right thing to do.
President Nixon, can you explain how the war brought to an end?
Yes. In 1972, North Vietnam launched a massive invasion onto the Southern Vietnamese. The Southern forces eventually prevailed with the help of U.S. air support. After negotiation with North Vietnam, U.S. signed the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. Under these accords, the U.S. would completely withdraw. This did not end the war, though. The fighting between the North and South Vietnamese continued until April of 1975, when Southern Vietnamese fell to communists.
Alright, thanks, Mr. President. That concludes our show for tonight, folks. Thanks for watching on 8 to 10 Minutes.